I recently faced a homeowner's worst nightmare. The HOA president tried to take my RV while she thought I was on vacation, and her reason, she said it was a parking compliance and needed to be removed. Funny thing is, the only thing removed in the end was her presidency when I flashed my badge. But let me start from the beginning. I got home 3 days early. The sky over my Denver suburb was the washed blue you see after a storm. The kind that makes everything look sharper and more honest. The Titan sat crooked in the driveway, its nose pointed slightly toward the lawn, its side door hung with a gap. I felt that cold slice of wrongness in my gut. I walked up the path, keys in my hand, and saw Karen Dinkle stuffing cloth bags into my rig like she was packing a picnic. She was loud. She always was loud and bright and sure. She barked orders to her husband, Bob, who moved like a man trying to shrink inside his own body. Tim, their son, stood at the edge of the driveway, 19, shoulders bowed and guilty-eyed. Karen pointed at me like I was a trespasser on a crime scene she had curated. Her voice cut the air. "It's rented," she shouted. "You can see the paperwork, officer. He's lying. He's here to steal it." She had her phone in one hand. She hit 911 with the other. The call came with the practiced flourish of someone who used emergency services as an extension of personal policy. I kept my hands open. I kept my face calm. I kept my feet planted. 2 patrol cars rolled up slow. I recognized the lead cruiser's bumper, Sergeant Harlan's unit. Harlan had a slow, methodical way of looking at people. He favored suspicion like some people favor scotch. He was a man who liked the world to sort itself quickly into guilty and innocent. He already had his jaw set. My neighbor Lee leaned over his fence. He was an older guy with a stack of paperwork in his hands. Squinting, he called out, "Marcus lives here. He's out of town a lot, but this is his address." His voice tried to bridge the gap between what was true and what Harlan wanted to be true. Harlan ignored him. He stepped forward and pointed at me. His voice was flat. "Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Step away from the vehicle." I complied. I raised my palms and did the small operator's count in my head. I was calm, but what tuned my senses tight was that the side door had pry marks. The metal by the latch showed the gray of exposed steel. Someone had used force. Someone had tried to bypass my lock. I pointed at the marks. I said, "Look at the latch. Those are fresh pry marks. That door didn't open that way this morning." I moved slowly. Harlan watched my hands like a hawk. Officer Dale trailed behind Harlan. He was new to the beat, new enough that his jacket still had that stiff small-town shine. Dale glanced from Karen to me and back again. I reached into the cup holder and lifted the device inside. It was a fob relay. Small, delicate, dangerous in its quiet way. "This," I said, "is how they lift signals. They put a relay near the owner's fob. It fools the car into thinking the key is close." I kept my voice level. I wanted the words to land like tools on a bench. Harlan stepped closer. He didn't want to see it. He wanted the story Karen told. Then I showed the jiggler. The jiggler was a hack's blunt instrument. It was still jammed in the ignition. You could see the plastic worn smooth where it had been forced. It smelled faintly of grease and panic. I tilted my head and let the immobilizer indicator catch his eye. The little red light on the dashboard blinked and had already pinged my team. The ping was from the immobilizer. The decoy drives only log tampering. Torres's text came through on my phone even as the alarm chirped on Karen's call. Kim ping too. I kept them tucked in my thoughts because I could not show the badge yet. That reveal would flex a different power. It would corral bodies and papers. For now, I had tools and truth. The neighbor who had vouched for me, Lee, kept talking. He raised his voice and tried to layer facts over noise. "Marcus has an RV permit. He checks the rig every 2 weeks. It's his. He's deployed a lot for work. Look at his mail." Lee's style was plain. He offered names and dates. Harlan's jaw tightened. He nodded to Dale like the neighbor was a background actor in Harlan's script. Tim stood a yard from Karen. He looked timid, a teen carrying guilt. When I looked at him, I saw a kid squeezed by an authoritative voice. I softened my tone and walked to him. "Tim," I said. "Hey, you okay?" He blinked. His skin had that teenage flush. "Sir," he started. "I didn't mean I'm not here to make it worse," I said. "Tell me what happened. Be honest." You're safe. He cracked the way glass does when pressure meets thin ice. He dropped his eyes and then looked up, voice small and edged. Mom wanted to make a point, he said. She said if she took the RV, she'd teach you about rules. She said she had proof it was rented, that you didn't care about the neighborhood. She said it'd be the perfect target. His words slid out in a rush. He flinched midway. He looked like he wanted to wish his words back into his throat. Harlan moved then, his hand reaching for cuffs, his motion was a blade. The crowd stepped back like they had been rehearsed. Karen snapped. See, he's trying to bully us. He's armed. Look at his hands. Her voice had the shriek of someone who thought loudness could be equal to truth. Men do what they have been taught to do. I raised my voice. It was not loud. It was calm. It was a different sort of steel. I'm FBI, I said. The words landed like puzzle pieces. The crowd swirled. Harlan froze like the world had pressed pause. He kept his hand near the cuff but didn't clasp them. My badge hung at my belt. The metal caught the light. For someone like Harlan, that was a turning point he did not expect. Badge in hand, I let it fall into view without theatrics. Special Agent Marcus Reed, I said. I live here. That's my RV. Those are Primarchs. That is a fob relay and a jiggler in the ignition. The immobilizer pinged my team 2 hours ago. Minutes later, the watch commander took the scene. Ia was looped in. Dale held the scene and kept everyone separated. I kept my sentences short. The truth was quiet sometimes. It needed to cash in on specifics. Silence expanded. Karen's face was a paper craft of rage and embarrassment. Bob shuffled his feet and avoided eye contact, like he could hide in the seams of his shoes. Tim's shoulders curled toward himself. Lee looked like he wanted to leave his fence and pull me into a bear hug. Harlan's jaw worked. He took half a step back. The tone in his mouth shifted. He spoke more carefully now. We got a call, he said. A woman said her neighbor was taking things. We have to respond to a 911. That's not a knock against 911. I said 911 is for emergencies. It's not a hammer to crush people with. I said it softly because some things like hypocrisy lost their heat when named plainly. Dale tucked his hands in his pockets. He looked at the jiggler in the ignition, the relay in the cup, and the prime marks on the door. He looked at my badge. He looked at Tim. He looked back at Harlan. The change in his face was a small confession. Harlan's phone buzzed. Someone at the station had heard the muffled version of events. Harlan put the call on mute, though the look in his eyes said the call had not gone unanswered. He took a breath and said, "Stay right here. Don't touch anything. We'll get statements." He turned to Karen. "Ma'am, we'll need you to step away from the vehicle." She clenched. "I'm the HOA president," she said. "I have authority. I can enforce rules. You can enforce bylaws," I said. "You cannot break the law." Karen's glare was a machine. "Do you want me to call?" She stopped because the dispatcher's voice came into her ear from the 911 line. Her face flamed a color that would not be flattering in photographs. I knew how she worked. She wielded calls like a weapon. She believed her loudness could shape reality. She confused authority for righteousness. Neighbors watched from the curb as we began to log things. Phones were up. No one was talking now. I had to be precise. My training is an insistence on small facts becoming ironclad evidence. Words are slippery. Metal and timestamps are not. I pointed to the cup holder. I handed the relay to Torres. We photographed the ignition. We photographed the prime marks. I asked Officer Dale to secure the scene and keep Karen and her husband separated from Tim. Just a precaution. He nodded and did it. Then, in that odd clatter between things, a tow truck rolled up. It had the logo of one of those HOA contract companies plastered on the side. It hummed like a wasp. The driver wore a uniform and a face that tried very hard to look like a professional. The driver said on the microphone that it was an HA tow and that he had authorization. I felt something shift. There are moments when a plan moves into action and you realize the edges are sharper than you thought. I asked for the hook operator's paperwork. He handed a clipboard with a letterhead from the HOA. It was filled with stamps and a captain's nod that looked legitimate. The operator started hooking the Titan. Before Dale could block it, the operator latched on. Harlan looked at the paperwork and then at my badge. He looked at Karen, who smiled like a queen watching a chess piece be captured. I felt the blood leave my face in a slow, aware flush. This was the sort of bureaucratic maneuver that chewed up truth with stamps and official seals. Wait, I said. I stepped between the Titan and the tow truck. You need to stand down. That authorized tow was not approved by the property manager. Private driveway owner or court only. And wall letter isn't enough. That company is not on our current list. Papers moved. People worried. Harlan paused, his face a map of two choices. The boom lifted an inch. I stepped in close, palms out. Private driveway, unhook now. The operator spoke into his mic, eyes on me. Dispatch, WA is live. Karen clapped once, sharp. Finally, community safety. Dale moved left, hand up. Sir, kill the winch. The operator hesitated, engines idled. Phones came out, neighbors filmed. Lee yelled from the fence, Karen, your safety flyer still says last year's date. Bob took one step like he might help. Then froze when Karen cut him a look that could chip ice. Kim's voice hit my speaker. Ping confirmed. If it leaves, we can trail it. Torres whispered, your call. Harlan stared at the paperwork like it might grow new pages. Operator, I said slow and clear. You tow this. You're part of a theft on camera. The winch winded, then stopped. The operator swallowed, then bumped the lever anyway. The Titan rolled an inch. Dale barked. That's enough. Sirens echoed somewhere far. Karen smiled like she'd already won the parade. I felt the line snap from talk to action. The truck nosed forward. We let it go, just far enough to follow. The tow operator's rig was a neat mechanical mouth. It swallowed the Titan and started to crawl away. Torres and Kim exchanged a look. Kim tapped her phone. She read aloud. GPS ping. Decoy rig. The baited Titan. Last seen moving south toward an industrial sector. My heart knocked. I felt the cold clean need to act. We shadowed the truck. I called in the state troopers. I kept a distance. It was a manageable kind of tail. The tow truck took back roads and old industrial lanes where the city's edges frayed into neglect. The driver's confidence sagged only slightly when he saw two unmarked state trooper units slip into following position. The copper flat storage yard leaned under an overpass like a secret. It was full of rigs with missing windows and cut wires. It smelled like gasoline and wasted things. The yard had that lawless feel of places where people bring items they don't mind losing ownership of. The tow truck pulled in and drove to a corner where other vehicles had been stripped down and catalogued. Troopers moved with the deliberate force of trained teams. They ringed the yard. They moved like choreography. Quiet, precise, efficient. They called on megaphones. Men and women in plain jackets stepped out of shadowy corners. We split up to clear the property. A side door banged. A guy in a gray hoodie bolted with a duffel. Hands. I called. He ran along a line of dead rigs, jumped a puddle, slipped on oil and pinwheeled. The duffel tore key fob spilled like candy. Torres cut him off at the gate. The guy faked right, went left, and hit an air hose. Down he went, face first, breath gone. I reached him, knee to his shoulder, calm voice. Don't move, you're done. He stared at the fobs. It wasn't my idea, he wheezed. The lady said WA had it covered. Name, I said. He shut his eyes. She called herself Karen. Said, make sure it goes south. A trooper cuffed him. Kim held up a burner phone from the shed. Same number chain, she said. The runner nodded at my rig. We just had to fake the start. Make it look like junk. He looks small now. She said the owner was a problem. I looked at the pile of copied fobs, the oily prints, the scared kid in a hoodie. Not a mastermind, a link. I felt the familiar adrenaline of an operation that had the right facts. Inside my Titan, we confirmed the decoy backups had logged tampering. At first glance, the interior looked like a camp struck by a storm. Messes, detritus, but importantly, the logs. The decoy drives had tamper logs and last access timestamps. We traced the pings back and found the neat electrical fingerprints that match the relay's signature. At the center of a pile of stolen electronics lay a set of fobs with curious fingerprints. They had been copied there. Someone had been attempting to harvest the signal. Another box contained a small stack of WA memos and lists of vehicles from the neighborhood. One had Karen's handwriting. Tim's face went white when he saw the stack. State troopers cuffed the tow operator. They cuffed a man I had not noticed. A greasy fellow with a list of names and a contract envelope. He had an email chain on his phone which we searched with a judge's telephonic warrant on body cam. The chain was coded in the blunt language of contractors. It named a drop, a time, a pickup. One thread had Karen's name. The phone had a message with a voicemail recording of Karen telling someone to make sure the rig goes south and we'll handle the parking fines later. The yard's owner tried to make himself small and clever. He had a story about buying junk and reselling parts. His story was a SCE of plausible lies. Troopers stripped the promises down. The GPS data chimed like a bell against his story. The decoy logs were incontrovertible. The tamper pings lined up with the hook time. We had a chain. We had a ring. Back at the neighborhood, word moved like a ripple. People peeked from blinds. Karen's smile had gone from cunning to brittle. The HOA's bylaws meant little when faced with a recorded voicemail and a ledger. You can shout rules into a void, but when paper and circuits speak, they speak louder than the loudest voice. Dale stayed lead while we took statements. Karen tried to climb out of the mess. She spoke into the phone, calling lawyers she clearly thought she could buy with volume. Bob stood muttering, trying to make himself small. Tim slipped away for a minute like a kid avoiding grown-up eyes. He came back with a different look. He had the look of someone who had done his small part and felt the gravity of the consequences. We had the evidence we needed. The state troopers had the paperwork to make arrests. They did. Karen was taken in. At the precinct, they booked her on conspiracy, false reporting to 911 and motor vehicle theft-related charges. She posted bond by evening. Bob was interviewed as a witness and Tim, who had been honest, was interviewed with care. The law treats young accomplices differently, and the troopers treated him like a witness who had made a bad choice. The HOA held an emergency meeting the next week. You could see the nervous theater in the room. Karen sat at the head of the table like she was still presiding over fate. Her hands shook when they set the interior cam clip on the projector. The room watched itself on the screen. Karen by my Titan calling 911, pointing angry. Someone in the back murmured. The gate logs were pulled up. I spoke from the sidewall. Mic low. One more clip. The room went quiet. Torres tapped play. Karen's voicemail filled the speakers. Make sure the rig goes south. We'll handle the fines later. Karen slammed the gavel. Out of order. Murmurs rose. Bob stood, voice shaking. I signed the tower. She told me it was routine. It wasn't. He looked at Tim. I'm sorry, son. Tim's eyes were wet, but steady. I helped. I was wrong. He turned to the room. He lives here. It was a lie. Marjorie, 2 rows back, lifted a tin. I brought cookies in the bylaws. Nervous laughs broke the air. The treasurer cleared his throat. Per bylaw 7.3. Misuse of emergency services as grounds for removal. He looked at Karen and for referral to law enforcement. Karen's face went hard. This is a smear. I held up the gate log print. Time stamp. 42 seconds to the tow route. A hand shot up. Motion to remove the president. Another second. The gavel hung in the air. The vote was fast. Hands rose like a tide. Karen was removed as president. The decision was not a triumphal shout. It was paperwork and emotion passed and minutes recorded. But it was a public unseating. And in our town, that meant something. Karen left the podium with a rigid back and a face that wanted to be larger than it was. She had miscalculated how evidence moved. Sergeant Harland was suspended pending IIA investigation. He would have to explain the choice to fixate on loudness instead of fact. He was a man who had depended on instinct. For him, the badge had been enough until it wasn't. The IIA team took his statement. They took the statements of the other officers. Truth had a way of cutting through old patterns. After that, the block cooled. Titan sat straight with a new lock, and the Dinklage family moved out within weeks. That night on the porch, coffee cold, I felt 2 things at once. Relief, we'd cracked the ring, and a quiet ache at how close noise had come to winning. Without a badge and logs, loudness might have buried the truth. Torres and Kim stopped by. We sat in silence for a while. Kim lit a cigarette and then put it out like she had lit and snuffed out a thought by force of will. You handled yourself, Torres said finally. He had that folded smirk that said more than congratulations. You played the long chess. I shrugged. I felt world-weary and sharp and tired. It's not over, I said. There's talk of lawsuits and law revisions. People will push back. Karen has supporters. She lost the job. Kim said, that's a start. We sat for a beat and let the street go quiet. I breathed deep. My life is not a TV script. It is a ledger of small truths and careful moves. This time, the ledger balanced correctly. I returned to work and watched the IIA process trudge through its way. Harlan's suspension opened a chance for him and his crew to recalibrate. I hoped he learned that the truth belongs to the slow, patient camera and not the loudest voice on the block. I hoped he would look at logs and fobs and timestamps like they were windows into people's lives. The HOA adopted two-tier toe approval and posted rules enforced with respect. Tim sent a short message months later. He said he had a part-time job at a mechanic shop and that he was trying to learn honest work. He was still young. His voice had potential for repair. I wrote him back a line. You did right when it mattered. It was a small thing, but we are all held by small things. Some nights I think about that thin line. Loudness isn't law. Calls aren't verdicts. Evidence wins. If there is a moral, it is that evidence beats noise. Loudness can be persuasive for a moment. It can bend attention, but paper and circuits do not yield to bluster. They are patient, stubborn witnesses. You cannot outshout a time stamp. The neighbors relaxed. The Titan stayed where it belonged. I slept better, but sleep is a soft victory. I kept my badge near when I went to bed. Not because I wanted to show it, but because the world is full of people who confuse power with right. My badge is a reminder that we carry tools for the quiet work, for the paperwork and the patience that keeps our quieter rights from being stolen by louder mouths. Weeks later, I stood at the HOA meeting when they finally voted to rework the tow list and auditing processes. Cameras and gate logs were linked in a public file. No single voice could anymore declare a private verdict that meant legal action. The board sent out a memo to the community. It read simply, "We will not weaponize emergency services." I thought about the neighbor who had vouched for me, Lee, the man who had raised his voice to say a simple fact. Neighbor Lee came by my gate and left me a pie as a neighborly gesture. I ate it in 2 slices like a weary man catching a quiet moment. My teammates and I drove out to the yard where the stripped rigs had been stacked. The towyard had been fined and shuttered. The owner was serving time for a string of thefts. Karen was scheduled for arraignment. Bob and Tim were not charged as principal actors, but their names lived on in the paperwork. Boys and men make bad choices under pressure. Consequences follow. Sometime after the courtroom dust had settled, Harlan came by. He had a letter in his hand from IIA, a suspension administrative, a small heavy thing. He said, "Agent Reed, I wanted to apologize. You changed how I see things." He seemed thinner. The apology was not dramatic. It was a folded honest thing. I nodded. "We all learn." I said, "I hope you do better." He left with his head lower, but his stride a little less sure. I wanted him to mean it. I wanted the lesson to stick. When I turned the key to the Titan months later, it fired like a thing that had been wrongly accused and then cleared. The immobilizer light blinked and went out. I took the rig down the road and felt a small thrill. It was mine. It had been tested and was intact. The world is messy. We make our claims and then prove them. I think now about the question that stewed under all of it like a low heat. Do facts matter when lies are louder? We live in a town like anyone else where noise can be persuasive. Sometimes the loudest gets traction. Sometimes the loudest erodes the fragile naivete of neighbors. But evidence has weight. It does not change with mood. It sits on servers and in logs and waits. I keep my hands clean. When I can. I keep my tone measured. I keep my paperwork tighter than my mouth. The Titan sits in its storage space, ready. I go out on cases for work. And I come back and close the gate and breathe the thin Colorado air. The world tilts and rights itself a little. If you are watching this, not literally, but if you are reading this as a lesson, listen. When someone tries to claim power with loudness, ask the small questions. Where's the log? Who signed the paper? What's the time stamp? Facts are humble. They will not shout. They will, however, win. That was the lesson of the crooked driveway and the Primarchs and the jiggler in the ignition. It was the lesson when a boy cracked under pressure and told the truth. It was the lesson when a badge saw a man about to be handcuffed because someone raised a voice. Evidence beats noise, always. When the Titan grew quiet behind me, the echo of gravel crunching under its tires faded into the small hush of evening. My hands rested on the steering wheel longer than they needed to. I watched the last smear of sun slide off the ridge, and the neighborhood exhaled. Kids' bikes leaned on porches. A sprinkler clicked in someone's yard. Somewhere, a dog barked twice and gave up. I liked that quiet. I needed it. The work had a way of sticking. Evidence, statements, the small recoil of a kid who'd been pushed into a lie. The case had ended in arrests and paperwork, and a community that needed mending. But there were threads left to follow, loose stitches on the hem of everything that had happened. I had a habit of tugging at those threads. Inside the house, the kettle hissed like a small patient thing. My wife, Susan, had left a post-it on the coffee maker that said, "You did good." That was my anchor. It held me when the world tilted toward petty noise. She'd come home with soup and the kind of soft smile that made it easy to talk in real tones. We ate at the kitchen table, the light low, the conversation mostly about nothing. Workday complaints, an upcoming parent-teacher conference for our daughter Bella, the neighbor with the new mailbox that looked deliberately Victorian. "I still can't believe you stood there and let Harlan say it," Susan said, spoon-scraping ceramic. "He blamed you like you were a prank caller." "I let him say enough," I replied. "Sometimes you have to listen to a man tear himself open before he realizes it hurts." She cocked her head. "You were mad." "Professional irritation," I corrected. I smiled because she'd asked for it. And a little personal satisfaction. Watching people realize they can be wrong is underrated. She laughed soft and bright. And then it dulled, thoughtful. "What are you going to do about Karen?" The meeting seemed to hum like an angry bee. "I'm not a judge of HOA elections," I said. "But I will say HOA's answer to paperwork, to bylaws, to voters. Noise isn't a vote." She reached for my hand. "Promise me you'll be gentle. There are kids in that family." I squeezed her fingers back. "I promise the truth," I said. Gentle isn't always the same thing. The Titan sat like an animal at rest, chrome glinting under the street light. I went out and ran a finger down the hood, feeling the faint dust left from months of tension. It had been a containment exercise more than an arrest. The thieves hadn't managed what they'd set out to do. They'd come for bait, and they'd left with nothing that caused real damage. Tim had been the hinge. His guilt was a key. When he cracked, everything turned. Tim had been 19, but looked younger. A thinness to him that suggested he was still finding which parts of himself he wanted to keep and which parts to discard. The boy's tongue had loosened when I sat with him and asked one calm question after another. No accusations, no raised voice, just questions and the slow, steady light of logic that makes the corners of a lie show. He'd admitted the relay rigger had shown him how to zero out cameras. He'd sat up straight when I described logs and timestamps, and something in him recognized an order more honest than the chaos Karen demanded. It made me suspicious in a quiet way. How power made people forget the cost of yelling. Karen's voice had been a weapon. 9/11 for her was a trigger she pulled to create a scene. It was easier to shout and get the world to move than to write a check or sign a petition. That's the thing about loud people. Their actions leave small, bright stains. You just had to spot them. Later, I returned to the Copper Flats yard we'd raided to pull DVR files and logs. The yard had a chain-link perimeter and a sign with faded letters. Copper Flats Storage Yard. The smell of oil and dust hit me before the building came into full view. A radio played low country music and a guy with a cap and a cigarette, Berto, leaned against the office, looking younger than the name suggested. "You read," he said, nodding, and then looked like he remembered me from a call about a fender bender months ago. "You with County State?" I told him FBI on a follow-up. He whistled low. "You got a warrant?" "No, I move slow. We can do this with your consent or I call a judge for a warrant." "Your choice." The Titan was towed here under a dubious HOA claim. "Your GPS logs show movement last month around 3 o'clock in the morning." "Who drove it? Who authorized the tow?"